here we are in LA and doing all the movie touristy things. In the meantime, Nikon bought RED, and the only place we can discuss it really is in Hollywood. And I have Christopher Malcolm here, who is a DP. He uses RED cameras, he uses ARRI cameras, he works in the industry. I'm going to ask him all about this, because where else are you going to find this information on the internet?
Yeah, should be fun to chat about. You know, there's a lot of exciting news going on right now in the world of both photography and motion pictures.
Fantastic. How are you today?
I'm doing great, man. I'm doing great. So my name is Christopher Malcolm. I'm a Los Angeles-based director, cinematographer, and also still photographer. I shoot campaigns for brands like Nike, Asics, Lululemon. Most of my still career has been on a Nikon, and most of my motion career has been shooting things like an Alexa or occasionally RED cameras. So that's why I thought it might be interesting to kind of chat, because have experience with them all.
All right, so you're using RED cameras for your work, as well as RED and ARRI, and you work in the industry as well.
Yes.
And if you know, Los Angeles, Hollywood is the right place to be if you want to shoot feature films, etc. Tell us why RED cameras are being used for feature films nowadays, and not, let's say, Sony, Canons, or Nikons in particular.
So, so this industry is and when I think about this, speaking specifically about like Hollywood filmmaking, and as well as the kind of commercial world, brands matter. So, each brand has its own kind of reputation. ARRI would, to me at least, ARRI is always the kind of gold standard right now in terms of like high level production. Then you've got brands like Panasonic, RED, obviously, Sony with their Venice line. There are certain kind of brands that, it takes a little while for them to build up their reputation in the industry. And RED has really been building that over the last, I think, 20 years. That RED's been building up. At first, they kind of started out, they were always kind of a leader in terms of technology, pushing like the resolution bounds of the industry. And later, kind of building up the brands to where they are now with the, the Komodo and the Raptor, which get a lot of work on some very high-end projects.
All right, so Nikon buying RED. Let's talk about a few things. What does it mean for cinematographers first, and later we also discuss what it will mean for stills photographers. So let's start with cinematographers. Do you think Nikon will continue RED as RED? And do you think it's a wise move for Nikon to buy RED in this case?
I think, we'll see how it plays out, but personally, I think it's fantastic. I think it's genius for them to have bought RED for one really important reason. Actually, that partnership makes a lot of sense. I mean, you'll hear a lot of people saying, well, why didn't Canon buy RED, or why didn't Sony buy RED? But I think Nikon and RED is actually a really kind of perfect partnership, because I think Nikon is strong where RED is weak, and I think RED is strong where Nikon is weak. And to that point, what I mean is Nikon, especially in the last couple years, has been pushing out some cameras that have some serious video specs. So something like the Z9, Z8. I've shot films that have played in festivals alongside, Alexas, footage from Alexas and Panavisions, with stuff I've shot on the Z9, and nobody knows the difference. There's really terrific image quality coming out of these cameras. But, again, Hollywood is a town that runs on brand identity and things like that. So you've got, a lot of people in the industry are hesitant to use Nikon cameras just because they're not used to them. It's not the norm. It's not industry standard. So they're kind of getting used to it. RED, on the other hand, has a great reputation within the industry. RED, has built that up over time through a lot of, some of the biggest films on the market, especially films like with David Fincher vouching for, for RED cameras, all that type of stuff. So they have that reputation, right? So now Nikon, by purchasing RED, essentially they bought into that reputation. Now that is a Nikon company now. They own RED. On the flip side of that, one of the things that RED at the beginning wasn't so great with was dependability. The early RED cameras were they were right. They've gotten better over time, so where now they're quite good. But one thing that Nikon's always stood for is dependability. I mean, those things are built like tanks. Like those things are built, they're workhorses, right? So if you take that level of kind of professionalism with the industry standing of RED, and you put those things together, now Nikon's in a position to have a product line all the way from, consumer video cameras, all the way up to, Academy Award winning projects. Right. So I think it's a great kind of partnership between the two of them to kind of to merge.
So as you said, Hollywood is a very small place where word of mouth makes a lot, and they use the brands that they've been using for the last 50 to 100 years. So you think that RED should stay RED, Nikon should run RED as its own company, and then they should release the Nikon branded consumer products with the RED functionality. Is that correct?
Yeah. I mean, obviously, I'm not inside the Nikon boardroom, so I don't know what they're planning. I mean, it seems to me the way to do it would be, again, if we look at a company, if we look at a company like Sony, right? So Sony's got, the FX30 on the low end of cinema cameras, all the way up to like the Venice or the Venice 2 at the very top end, right? So you've got everything from people who are like content creators, all the way to people who are actually working on, Top Gun Maverick, all in the same brand, right? I think Nikon, especially right now, because they're still building Nikon's name in the video world. I think personally, if I were them, what I would do is I would focus the Nikon brand on consumer to prosumer, right? So anything from like an entry level vlogging camera all the way up to something like the Z9 or a potential Nikon cinema camera that might be in the $5,000 to $6,000 range, somewhere in there, and then let the RED brand stand for what it is on the high end, right?
So let's talk about RED first. So do you think that Nikon Z mount will come to RED cameras and also Nikon autofocus? I know that RED is using Canon autofocus right now. Do you think that's going to go away and we're going to see those features coming from Nikon?
Yeah, it seems obvious to me that the next version of the RED cameras will, at least at a bare minimum, they'll come with the option of a Z mount. They may have two versions of it, so maybe you can buy the Z mount version or the RF version just to make sure existing RED customers are happy. But the other thing about the motion picture world is like, if you're renting Alexa, you're renting whatever, that mount, a lot of times those mounts are interchangeable.
Yes.
So it's not abnormal for you to buy a camera with one mount and then you can actually just change your own mount depending on what kind of lens, because sometimes you want to use a certain vintage lens and that only comes in a PL mount, so you got to change to a PL mount. You've got to, the lens is really what's important, at that top level. So in terms of the mount, I think the new REDs will probably have an option of either an RF or a Z, at least for a little while. And then what I think in terms of like autofocus, which is something that, again, when you're talking about Hollywood movies, autofocus isn't really a thing. You have you're going to have a first AC pulling your focus. You're going to do that, stuff like that.
So we're going to pause here because this is a very important point. For cinema world, autofocus is not important at all. So autofocus is something that maybe videographers would use for wedding type shots or events and things like that. But if you're working on a feature film or documentary, you generally will buy a lens to get the look. You will buy old vintage glass for that particular look, or to make the image less digital. So autofocus is not that important. I assume that it will come anyway, but it's the feature that really won't be utilized to 100% on this type of camera.
Yeah. And again, if you're buying something like, so let's say you're buying like a Komodo, which comes in around $5,000 and you're using it for content creation, then okay, maybe, you're going to want something like that. But RED in general, if you're talking about like the higher end stuff, the lenses you're putting on there are exorbitantly expensive and they're all manual focus. And it's because, filmmaking is a team environment. So that's not it. Now, with that said, what I do think is a potential opportunity is for a camera like the Komodo, which, you have a lot of kind of content creators buying, which is like in the $5,000 range or something like that. If you could bring Nikon's autofocus technology to a camera like that, oh man, that's boy howdy. And then in reverse, there's one thing that's also industry standard about RED, which is great about this partnership, is that RED uses RED Code RAW, these R3D files, which is part of the whole lawsuit, So we know we probably
all know that.
You probably heard about that, but
I have a feeling that RED just sued this and you can say, "We'll just buy you,"
Yeah, that's probably I don't know. There might be what happened behind.
Do you think 20 years later, when they declassify all the files about this particular merger, purchase per se, we'll find out the real truth?
I think the truth is, what do they say in the X-Files? The truth was out there.
That's right.
It's gonna happen.
I want to believe. So let's talk about RAW format a little bit. So RED has a patent on the RAW functionality and compression, and that obviously was the reason why they sued Apple and Sony at the time, as well as Nikon, and all had to settle out of court. So now this patent basically belongs to Nikon. What can we see from it in Nikon cameras as well as RED cameras?
So I think that's another thing that is probably less talked about than it needs to be, which is that, so the RED, because of their reputation, because they've been around for 20 years in the cinema industry, a lot of people use RED Code RAW, use the R3D files, and they're used to it. So you're talking about not only cinematographers, but colorists, visual effects people, like, throughout the industry, they're used to that file format. So for example, Nikon just came out with, the raw video in the Z9 and Z8, and it's fantastic. I use it all the time, I like it. It's just not as used to, in the industry, they're not as used to it because it's brand new. It's only been around for a little bit. So it'd be amazing if RED Code RAW were available in like a Z9 or Z8, or even all the way down the Nikon line. I mean, you think about what advantage that would give to Nikon as on a video standpoint, if all their cameras from A to Z could shoot RED Code RAW.
Like just high price products.
Yeah, like not just the high price products, but like, down to whatever the new, Z6 or whatever that's, whatever that's going to be. If that can shoot, RED Code RAW, oh boy, that's going to give them a real leg up, I think, on the competition.
And then let's talk about sensors as well. Obviously, RED has their own sensor, and they have this global shutter sensor with 70 stops of dynamic range. Mm. And you told me that they also have some partnerships with other companies where they give the sensors to. Let's talk about this a little bit.
Yeah, so think about, this Nikon RED partnership is, you have to remember, Nikon's not just getting the cameras, right? RED's got, partnerships with companies like Panavision, which is one of the biggest names in the game, to work with them on their sensors that go into the Panavision cameras. They've got a partnership, not on the sensor side, but actually, a little bit, like they did a recent partnership on just one project with ARRI to pair the VistaVision sensor with, I think the Master Primes. And so, RED has relationships throughout the industry that also benefit Nikon. So it's not just the camera itself, but those partnerships, which again, we're talking about what's the plan going forward. The smart thing is let RED be RED and kind of, keep those partnerships brewing, because the more established RED is in the industry, the more now Nikon is in the industry.
Indeed. And also Nikon owns Macro Motion Control, which produces robotic arms that's being used everywhere from television, sports games, music videos, as well as feature films. It allows you the way to program the same movement of your robotic hand and record that motion for different takes. Now, my thinking is that this is one piece of a puzzle, then RED comes in, that's another piece of it, where you can combine those things and sell it to a rental house. And let's be honest, no one spends 20, 30,000 pounds for their own cameras. They genuinely rent them. Combine those, that could be a part of complete package. And obviously that potentially may come into prosumer-consumer level as well, where those things will start to be cheaper, or we'll start maybe to see something that becomes cheaper to produce, so consumer can buy those and use them for their photography or videography work. Yeah,
that's something that's very important, what you just hit on, because the other thing that people need to keep in mind is, so RED is a relatively small company. They on the day of the announcement, everybody's saying, how many employees RED has, versus Nikon. RED's a relatively small company. They have their, it's unclear, if they manufacture their own sensors but they have some, they'll be able to set up their own sensors. They've got all this tech and all this stuff in a relatively small company, right? Well, any first year business major will tell you, like now you bring in a Nikon with its factories around the world to that tech, and now you've got economies of scale. So now that allows RED cameras to get a little bit cheaper. That allows actually Nikon to have more tech, in its cameras. And so, if you are a RED customer, you may actually see some real benefit from the fact that now Nikon owns RED. Your products can now be made more efficiently, and therefore you might actually see a little bit of a price drop on especially some of the mid-range RED cameras. The ones at the top are made to RED, like those are expensive, but the ones in the mid-range, something like a Komodo or Komodo X.
So I'm talking about basically the production volume. The higher the production volume, the cheaper things generally become. And we see the technology trickling down from the top products to the bottom. Now let's talk about lenses a little bit. So RED manufactures their own lenses. I assume Nikon will bring some expertise in that field.
Yeah, and so Red originally there are Red lenses. Most people, I think, they're shooting Reds are using other other
So
lenses.
Cine lenses on PL mount.
Yeah, yeah, different kind of things. But there's actually a pretty nice opportunity there for Nikon too, because again, the way I always think about it is like when mirrorless started, right? When the first shift over to mirrorless happened, you had Canon and you had Nikon, right? Those two companies took two different paths.
Indeed.
Canon had some really great bodies out of, they focused on the camera body itself right out of the thing. And then, but the glass was good, but it was right. Nikon focused glass. So from day one, those lenses were amazing. And then their cameras have kind of caught up over time, right?
Indeed.
So now if you are a RED user and you have this RED with a Z mount, right? Maybe you'll be tempted to try out a Z lens, right? And as soon as you try out that Z lens, you're like, crap, this is an amazing lens. This is an amazing if you have that mount, you get that option, then that allows Nikon to push a lot more lenses. Or again, if you're talking about high-end cinema line, they're renting all kinds of stuff anyway. So they might be renting, they may be using that Nikon lens, that Z lens for something. They'll be using some Cook lenses, they'll be losing all kinds of stuff, to fit onto that body.
Do you think we will see a line of Nikon Cine lenses for Z mount as well as PL mounts?
Over time, I think probably the transition to the industry using a Z mount is going to take a little while. It can happen, but it's going to probably take a little while. So it'll depend on if it's, if it makes sense business-wise for Nikon to produce, a dedicated Nikon. I'm sure R&D is already there. I'm sure they're already, thinking about building, the Nikon Z mount Cine lens that they can then put onto their, now the RED/Nikon cameras.
Do you think we'll see Nikon PL mount lenses?
That would be interesting. I mean, one thing to consider is the fact that, as quiet as it's kept, there's actually a lot of top DPs that are actually using Nikon glass right now. They're not necessarily using the new Z mount glass, but a lot of, again, if you're a top, cinematographer, you're very specific about the lens you're choosing. So a lot of like vintage Nikon glass has just been actually rehoused as a cinema lens, because that's really all it is. It's just a different housing.
Yeah, we were part of this actually. We are selling to quite a few Hollywood companies that they would buy Nikon glass and then rehouse it to proper Cine mount and just Cine design of lenses. And then they would charge probably 10 times what they pay for that Nikon lens for the rehouse lens.
Yeah. So I think cinematographers, in terms of like Nikon glass, there's a real opportunity there. You can have, again, like the existing, Z mount glass can go straight onto the new RED whenever that comes out with an available Z mount thing. And then, I think I don't see why, if you're going to own RED over the long haul, it only makes sense that you're going to have some native glass, and Nikon's going to be in charge of the glass, not the RED side. So if you have, absolutely, there will definitely be a Nikon. I would say a Nikon cinema lens within 5 years.
That's true, and I'm thinking because RED has all those contacts with Hollywood.
Yeah.
And they probably get a lot of feedback from the people who use their cameras and lenses that potentially may get fed straight to Japan for them to create their designs around that feedback.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think there will definitely be a cinema lens from Nikon. In the meantime, I think existing RED users will continue to use the scattershot of lenses that are available around the world. And then again, the other thing to keep in mind when we're talking about cinema cameras is that for the most part, most bigger cinema cameras, if you think about like an Alexa or something like that, they have interchangeable mounts. So in other words, you can actually change your own mount. So for example, like a lot of the RED users, on the day of the announcement might have been a little panicked because they're like, well, but I've got all this RF glass, I've got this. You can imagine, cameras going forward, if you just make an interchangeable mount, you can put an RF mount on there, you can put a Z mount on there, you can put a PL mount, which is the industry standard. You can put, whatever it is on that, those upcoming RED bodies. That would be very normal within this industry for something like that to happen.
Okay, so we talked about cinematography side of things. Let's talk about Nikon consumer side of things. So you think that Nikon will release a dedicated video cameras for consumers and prosumers? So we're talking about anything from the price of Z30, about maybe $500, all the way up to maybe $6,000-7,000 or so. Let's start from the top. What do you think Nikon will release?
Yeah, so I think actually this acquisition actually frees Nikon up to be to actually really focus on certain things. So for example, as we talked about earlier, I think probably the smart thing to do, what I think they're going to do, is let RED to kind of continue to occupy that high end of the market. So from the the Komodo up, all the way up to the motion picture cameras. But then that frees up Nikon with the Nikon brand to really focus on the kind of consumer and prosumer end of the market. So, kind of, I know this is a Nikon channel, but, like the analogy I give is like Sony. Sony's got like the FX30 on the bottom end, all the way up to the Sony Venice, but like the FX30 to like the FX6, somewhere in there, like that price range, which takes you all the way from like very consumer level cinema camera all the way up to like a affordable, $6,000-$7,000 cinema camera, right? So I think Nikon should focus, really the Nikon branded video cameras in that thing to start, because they've got the great, those are cameras that take advantage of the great autofocus, small mirrorless portable sizes. I think that's really an area where Nikon's going to be able to play.
All right, and we start to see different form factors, I assume, because dedicated video cameras will require a lot of attachments. Do you think we'll see more cameras like FX3 and FX30, and will we see a proper box camera as well?
That, it's interesting because, I, for one, because I work as both a photographer and a director DP, like I've been asking them for a Nikon box camera for years. Like I really want like a box camera, and the advantage of a box camera versus a mirrorless camera, just for those who might, it's like there's more room for it. The ports are a little easier to set up. You've got things like SDI connections. You've got different things like that are a little bit more useful, for filmmakers versus a mirrorless camera where you're looking at just flipping from shooting stills to motion all the time, right? So I think the advantage of having a box camera in the Nikon format, which I've always wanted, will be fantastic because it puts you again into like, again, the analogy being something like the FX6, which is kind of like a cinema camera but with autofocus and kind of great. So yeah, so this is actually the RED studio. Here's the trucks and sound stages. So this is actually now Nikon. So this is also now we'll be owned by Nikon.
So RED is not only renting the cameras to cinematographers, they also provide the place to shoot and record the sound and video.
Yeah, so this is actually RED Studios we're outside of right now. So it's films like The Artist was shot here. A lot of like motion pictures were actually shot here at the studios, which is, I guess, is now like Nikon studio officially.
Yeah. So Nikon owns this. Hello and welcome to the second part of our conversation with Christopher Malcolm. We recorded the second part right in front of the RED Studios, but it was the only day in the year where we had storm warning and the winds were so severe that the audio is literally unsalvageable. So what we decided to do is catch up a month later. There's quite a few things happen in the Nikon RED world. So we're going to discuss all this and we're going to wrap up our conversation back in LA a month ago. So, Chris, let's talk about a few things. So Nikon finally completed the acquisition of RED. So that happened just before NAB show. And then RED was showing their cameras at NAB. There was V-Raptor X and I think V-Raptor XL cameras, but it was a part of a Nikon stand. So few questions for you. Tell us about NAB for us, people who don't live in the United States. Just tell us all about it. How big is the show? What people normally do there? And then let's talk about RED and Nikon.
Yeah, so NAB is probably one of the biggest trade shows here domestically. It's where all the manufacturers go to show their new toys. So I'm sure you're probably inundated with all the YouTube clips day in, day out of this person announced this person announced this person announced a new stapler. Like they're not like anything and everything. They're trying to get out there and put it out there. So it's awesome to see, again, finally, like the Nikon RED and the Mark Roberts, motion control, all that stuff in one booth kind of gives you a really good indication of what Nikon plans to do and, what the new joint venture is going to look like. They're trying to really go at this whole thing with all their forces as one thing.
Fantastic. And then when Nikon acquired RED, so they've appointed their new CEO, which is Keiji Oishi of Nikon's business imaging unit, and RED's president, Jared Land, become an advisor to the company. Mm-hmm. So they've mentioned that they want to keep RED as RED. There was a big panel of Jared Land talking about the acquisition of RED by Nikon. Tell me a little bit about it, because I think that's what a lot of people were waiting for. Because before we were speculating Now we actually had the now ex-president of RED coming out and saying what they're going to do.
Yeah, I think the first thing people will understand is, and I think people know this, is that the corporate cultures of RED and Nikon are very, very different. You know, you got traditional Japanese company with Nikon, and RED, even for an American company, is very untraditional. Like their kind of brand is overturning the apple cart, you know, doing things differently. You know, as an example, over the years, if people ever had a problem with their RED camera, they could actually call Jared himself. You know, like it was like one of those kind of like, it was like one of those companies where it's like everything's kind of off the cuff and kind of like fun. So I think when it was first announced, before anybody knew anything, like even the professional nature of the press release, the Nikon release, you know, is different than the way RED would have released a press release. So you have right as soon as the before Jared spoke, you know, we had the news just first broke. You had a lot of, I think, RED users that were maybe a little panicked because they didn't know what was going to happen to RED. They thought this RED that they loved, they've grown to love, it was kind of going away. So it was great to actually hear Jared actually came out and talked a little bit about that process. And he kind of confirmed a little bit what, you know, what we talked about before. And then I think any smart person would expect, which is essentially they're going to let RED be RED, let Nikon be Nikon. They're eventually going to kind of fuse and kind of, you know, have this marriage. But the key thing is trying to make sure that all the stuff that people love about RED continues to be that way. And all the stuff that people love about Nikon continues that way. And you're actually fusing the strengths of those two companies as opposed to one taking away from the other, one trying to take over the other. For example, when are we going to see like a hybrid Nikon RED camera? When is that type of thing going to happen? And I think, you know, these things take time. You know, as you talk about on the channel all the time, like these Nikon cameras, it's like, when's the new Z6 or Z7, whatever? You know, like these things, like they're like on a year's worth of research and development before they come out. So in other words, we're not going to see like a new Nikon RED hybrid next month drop. Like this is not something that's going to happen. But I think the engineering teams for both companies are already talking. They're already having those conversations. They're already starting to share tech back and forth. And so, you know, in the future, we're definitely going to see a really great collaboration between them, probably on a new product. I don't know when that'll come out, maybe a year and a half, 2 years from now, something like that. But right now they're in the honeymoon phase. You know, they're kind of getting to know each other. They're courting each other. They're in this relationship and they're kind of figuring it out. But there's some really cool things ahead. I think probably the first thing you'll see would be an option for the Z mount on a camera like the Komodo or on like the V Raptor, where the camera itself is still kind of, I mean, those cameras are pretty, relatively new, and they're, so the RED cameras I'm talking about, and they're really, really good. But they'll probably start offering an option for Z mount. So that'll probably be the first step, I think, that you'll see, and then eventually you'll get down the line to more technology.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to call KGO issue directly on his line, just like Jared Land used to do, But yeah, one of the things that came out of that panel, which is great to hear, and that kind of confirms that Nikon wants RED to be RED, where they clearly said that they will continue to support Canon RF lenses as a part of their mount, and I assume autofocus as well, which is really good. Another thing that we heard is actually confirmation that Nikon is considering making Cine optics, and we kind of discussed it 10 minutes in this interview. So, but for us, it was a month ago. So that was quite interesting to hear. But as you say, a few more years for Nikon RED joint venture. And let's talk about what that means to the consumer. So a couple of things. Do you think Nikon will release a Z series video line of cameras as well as lenses? That's question number one. And number two, we're going to talk about what that means for stills photographers as well. But let's just talk about Z video system. Do you think it's coming? Do you think the price range is going to be somewhere in between, let's say, Z mirrorless cameras and RED video cameras? What are your thoughts on this?
So, what I really envision, and again, I don't know if this is true or not, but what I envision, and I think seems to make the most sense, and why this merger makes so much sense for consumers, is that by having Nikon, which is kind of, their video lies more on the prosumer, single operator kind of range of things, right? And then you have RED, which, works in large Hollywood productions. By having that, you've got the whole spectrum, right? So you've got everything from down to probably like a Z6 or something, something like that, around $2,000 range, all the way up to the V Raptor XL, which I don't know how much it is, but it's a lot more than $2,000. It's a lot. So I think if right in the middle of that is really the most interesting section to figure out exactly where they're going to do, because again, you've got something like Komodo right now that sits around $5,000.
Hmm.
And you have something like the Z9, which is a more of a hybrid camera, obviously, but that's also sits around the $5,000 mark. If you're thinking about like a traditional cinema camera from Nikon, you would think that that would sit somewhere between like the $5,000 to $10,000 range. But again, Red already has Komodo at 5, and they have the Komodo X, the new
Hmm.
version, which is at around 10. So the question is really, from a marketing standpoint, does it make more sense to have that cinema camera branded as a Nikon camera? Or does it make more sense to have that cinema camera branded as a Red camera? In the short term, I think it makes more sense to have that cinema camera branded as a Red camera, simply because that is, that has the current name recognition, right? So my thought process for the way it would look to the consumer as this marriage starts, they would kind of start to get more and more integrated, the products between Nikon and Red. They would still look to bring customers in to the Nikon Red system through like a Z6 or something something like that right there, where you're kind of getting started with that. And then as you progress, you're progressing up to essentially to the red line at the top.
Hmm. So do you think it's a form factor thing more than anything else? Do you think Nikon will compete more with the likes of Sony and Canon for type of things? But if we talk about box cameras like Komodo, or let's say in this
Yeah.
case, Blackmagic just announced their
Mhm.
cinema camera in the
Pyxis.
yeah. So you think that will be left to Red, and Nikon will just compete with the likes of Sony FX3 and Canon R system?
Yeah, I think the box, just because again, within the industry, Red already has that brand recognition. Red are, so Nikon is the newcomer on that. So I think just from a marketing standpoint, I think it makes sense to keep that Red badge on that box camera for as long as possible, for a couple years, until people don't think that, oh, Red's going away, Red's in trouble. People get used to the idea of these two, of Nikon Red, Nikon Red, Nikon Red, until again you get to that point where you actually then have that hybrid Nikon Red camera that's co-branded or whatever, which still may be a couple years away. I think maybe when you get to like that stage, then you could be talking about a true cinema camera with a Nikon badge on it hitting the market. I think right now, if you like say to release like a Nikon cinema camera within the next year or two, it would probably compete a little bit with the Red camera, and it might confuse customers a little bit. That's just my thinking in terms of like the business side of it. I think they'll probably keep Red as, from a box camera standpoint, from a true cinema camera standpoint, they'll keep that there. They may introduce, I can see them introducing maybe something, put like a Z9 inside of a box. The way Blackmagic put basically their full frame pocket camera into the side of a Pyxis. So I mean, you could try to do something like that. I'm not sure if they do that though, because again, if you had the Nikon Z9 inside of a box around 5K, and you had the Red Komodo inside of a box at 5K, they might fight,
Mm.
and you don't know if you want the new siblings fighting.
But do you think we will see something like Sony FX3, which is about
Yeah,
£4,000,
yeah.
and maybe it's not a true cinema camera per se, but it's a videographer's
Mhm.
camera for sure, and it's,
Yeah.
let's say, above and beyond just our kind of general still photographer's cameras. Do you think we'll start to see something like this? And obviously, price range is going to be below their flagships like Nikon Z9. It probably will cost around Z8. Do you think we'll start to see more things like this?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I think everything under $5,000, customers should be super happy, because I think everything under $5,000, what you're going to start seeing is some of that Red tech, like Red Code Raw and things like that, going into the $2,000, Nikon camera or something like that. So those cameras, like the FX3, I think is like $3,500 or something like that.
Hmm.
Nikon really, be honest with you, like the Z9 and Z8 can kind of already compete with like an FX3, and in terms of technology and stuff like
Hmm.
that. I think once you add Z6, Z7, Z8, Z9, Z5, or whatever that, and you start putting some of that Red tech in, I think that's where the Nikon branded products are really going to be able to start taking a chunk, because now, those people who are used to, shooting with Red on higher end productions, but they want like a smaller running gun camera set, like an FX3, that you can shoot anything from a big Hollywood feature to running gun content, on an FX3. Again, you can already do that on the Z8, Z9, but by having the Red as the big brother, and by porting some of the technology from Red down into those Nikon cameras, that makes those cameras a lot more attractive. Again, for people who are in the industry and want like a smaller camera already, or even people again who are getting into industry and looking for a brand that they can buy into and grow all the way up from beginner camera all the way up to the cinema camera line.
So you think we will see the Nikon technology in those type of cameras? And we're talking autofocus, you know, so obviously Nikon has
Oh yeah.
great autofocus system, so that will implement it towards video production as well with Nikon cameras. And whoever wants to advance further, now you'll have maybe a Komodo to step up to, or even Raptor for the bigger projects, etc. But then we will start to see perhaps an autofocus performance on those cameras as well. I am very excited what came from NABA this year, and the Pyxis, Blackmagic Pyxis, is incredible camera for the price. Obviously, the box form factor under $3,000, it's incredible, and I like what Blackmagic does in this space. However, I was thinking about Komodo the other day. It's actually not that expensive at $5,000 compared to what they used to cost, because if you would ask me, let's say, about RED before the acquisition, I would say RED means expensive stuff, you know, so it's something that, let's say, maybe a student can't afford. But let's say $5,000, it's basically a cost of Nikon Z9. So, you know, obviously, if you still shoot, you'll buy a Z9 or Z8. But if you're a videographer and that's your bread and butter, it's not actually a lot of money to spend in the cinematographer's world. And obviously, you can rent out more expensive cameras for the bigger projects. I am very, very excited. What was the most exciting announcement for you during the show?
I actually really excited about the Pyxis. I don't know if I can say that because I know it's a Nikon chip.
That's fine. Look, we're all enthusiasts, so I'm really happy. Yeah.
So here's the thing that I really like about the Pyxis, and it relates actually back to something that I think Nikon can do well. Is so what Blackmagic, and I know we're talking about Nikon RED, but this will just kind of give you a perspective. So what Blackmagic has always really done quite well is Blackmagic cameras give you like a really great image, like a top level cinema quality image for not a lot of money. Like just, you know, like people just starting out or people that, you know, just are cost conscious can get great image for not a lot of money. You know, the trade-off is some of the cameras, the ergonomics can be a little strange, but the image is fantastic. Like it's really quite good. You know, I mean, it can rival cameras 10 times the cost in terms of the image quality. I don't know how they do that. The problem, of course, with the Blackmagic was always, again, the form factor, which again, they kind of made them to look like DSLRs or mirrorless cameras, which, you know, you can still build up. But, you know, when you're working in the cinema world, you really want like a box, because, you know, everything's modular. No one production is the same. So the advantage of the box system is that you can you build it out the way you want it to do. You know, again, the reason why, as you were just saying, you know, if you're in the Nikon world, if cinema is your main thing, you're probably going to opt for the Komodo just for the form factor, because it's built to be, you know, rigged out in a certain way and put monitors in a way that, you know, that doesn't really matter to still photographers. So yeah, so even though I would say probably the most exciting thing at NAB for me actually was the Pyxis, but what that portends on the Nikon side, you know, obviously most of the stuff at NAB in terms of Nikon, which is getting people used to the idea of this merger happening and getting people comfortable with the fact that, you know, this is a real thing, that, you know, both sides are taking it seriously. So I think what Nikon's job at NAB was basically to get existing customers of RED and people in the industry comfortable with the idea. And I think that'll be probably Nikon's main job over the next year to 18 months. That will be it, is getting existing customers within the cinema world comfortable with this idea that this new company is a good idea, which it is. I definitely think it is. But, you know, kind of getting people comfortable with that, getting them past any initial hesitation they might have about RED not being RED anymore, and getting them comfortable. So I think that's what Nikon did at this NAB, and I think that they did a good job of that, I think.
I'm glad you mentioned Pyxis, and you're excited as much as I am. And my hope is, I have a feeling that we're going to get more of a competitors with Canon RF system, dedicated video cameras, or let's say Sony FX3. That's, I think, what Nikon is going to do with their line, so to differentiate them from, let's say, a RED lineup where you got box cameras. But my hope is for Nikon to look at what Blackmagic does, at how disruptive they are, and bring the system into the Z reality, you know, with fantastic image quality, but then add autofocus on top of that, and keep the prices reasonably low compared to the cinema cameras. So that at least my hope is, but obviously the man can dream. Let's talk about what all these acquisitions mean for still photographers, because our channel is mainly for still photographers. They like their photography, they like their cameras, but they also ask, what does it mean for me? a still photographer. What are your thoughts?
I think, what I'm excited for I'm a still photographer as well. So I think what I'm excited for from the tech side that does affect still photography is the potential for advancements in sensor technology, because again, Red's already developing their own, so the Red XL, Red naming conventions are a little strange for me, but the top one is the Red V-Raptor XL, which I believe they advertise something like 16 stops of dynamic range, 60, something like that. And they're already developing their own sensor technology. So what I'm excited about, and I think will actually affect still photographers, is if you put the two brains of those two companies together in terms of how their sensor, design, how they're working with that type of stuff will actually trickle down into still photographers' pockets as well and lead to better image quality for everybody down the line. Obviously, 90% of the benefits of this merger are going to be on the video side. But in terms of a still photographer, you will actually see some benefit, I think, to the merger.
Yeah, I mean, to this, obviously, the global shutter, cinematographer cameras pioneered this.
Yes.
Increase in resolution. Again, a lot of cameras now pushing 12K already. We haven't bought 8K TVs yet, but a lot of cameras pushing 12K, and that allows for cropping capability. It's also will come to still as a part of the sensor. Dynamic range.
Yeah.
Some cameras pushing up to 20 stops nowadays, while normal stills cameras are about 14, 15 stops. So all of that advancement in sensor development will transfer towards stills photographers. But also I'm thinking, like built-in ND filters, which we have on a lot of cinematographers' cameras nowadays. I find that would be a very interesting feature even to have on stills cameras, especially, let's say, if you're shooting a lot with the wide apertures outside. So let's say if you want to use your 85 1.2 at 1.2, and then suddenly you have a built-in filter in your camera where you just press the button and it stops it down by something like 4 stops. That would be absolutely incredible as well.
Yeah, that as someone who, again, shoots on a lot of similar cameras that have built-in NDs, it is hard to not have built-in NDs. Just actually, it's such like a no-brainer. It's like you just figure like every camera should have built-in NDs. It's just something that should happen. Yeah, that's a no-brainer to me. But like something like the Canon, like the C200, or like a lot of those kind of similar cameras in the Canon range have like the built-in NDs, like the FX6, like things like that. Have like in the $10,000 to $15,000 range. A lot of those cameras will have a lot of the built-in NDs. The Blackmagics, because again, they make stuff for less money than whatever. Some of their cameras actually do have the built-in NDs. I would love to see that. If Nikon's listening, if they want to take a chunk out of the counter, next time they bring out the Z9 II or the next Komodo or whatever if they put built-in NDs as an option, that would be fantastic. The only kicker you have to worry about with built-in NDs is you have to make sure that, like Blackmagic had this problem sometimes. Like sometimes they keep their costs low, but there's a trade-off to being low. Well, they had built-in NDs, but there will be like a color shift between the NDs, so like they didn't. It wasn't perfect. So that's something I'm sure Nikon is keeping in mind to make sure that, because Nikon obviously wants to deliver a very terrific product. Because again, if you're shooting cinematography specifically, like you can't afford there to be a color shift between, let's say you're racking your exposure during a shot or something like that. You can't have there be a color shift because you can't take that out of the video. But if they can figure that out, that would be a major advancement. Yeah, people would love that. So if Nikon, if you're listening, find a way to get built-in NDs into your cameras and you will make noise.
Yeah, I assume that with Nikon's expertise in glass as well as coatings, I think, that problem will be solved very quickly. Thank you very much, Christopher, for joining us today. Tell us where people can find you on the internet.
Yes, I'm pretty around. So if you go to online, it's just ChristopherMalcolm.com. You'll be able to see some of both my directing and my photography work. On the social web, there's Instagram, just Christopher Malcolm Photography is usually where you'll find me. And then I do have a YouTube channel called Movable Canvas, where I don't really talk about gear. It's all about movies and just the art of movies and using case studies to talk about storytelling. But yes, although I do talk about gear a little bit, I write for F-Stoppers. So if you see any of my articles on F-Stoppers, you might see a review or two there.
Well, it's been an absolute pleasure to meet you in person last month in LA, as well as catch up with you now from London to LA. I'm very excited what Nikon and RED are going to do in the next couple of years. I hope you, the viewer, as well. Thank you for watching this interview. Thank you, Chris, and thank you all. We will see you next time at, what was it? At Grace of Westminster YouTube channel. I forgot the name of the channel.